Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, we host over 150 free programs, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. To find out more about the National Arts Club, you can find us at nationalartsclub.org or on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of our literary committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, A Life in Publishing, as we're joined by Henry Ferris, a publishing industry veteran who worked closely with US President Barack Obama on the manuscript that became the acclaimed bestseller, Dreams from My Father. Henry has also worked with celebrities such as astronaut Buzz Aldrin, novelist Amy Ephron, and columnist Gail Collins. Henry will be in conversation with fellow writer and NAC member David Masello about his craft, his life, and why books need a good editor. Following the discussion will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, here is David. Please enjoy the program.
Thank you very much. I'm David Masello, a member of the Literary Committee of the National Arts Club. I guess you could say that all of our lives have been edited down these days, but here we are. And thank you for being here. Something like 300 of you I just heard. I've never had 300 people in my living room before. And thank you, Henry Ferris, for being here, live from, I believe that's your dining room on the Upper West Side.
Dining room, Upper West Side.
Good. Tonight, everybody, you're going to meet Henry, who's a seasoned, charismatic, highly active book editor. Given Henry's experience at Simon & Schuster, Houghton Mifflin, Random House, HarperCollins, and William Morrow, it's likely he could edit the Oxford English Dictionary down to a tri-fold pamphlet and have it still read perfectly. Henry and I met at Simon & Schuster some, hold on now, 40 years ago. I was a young editor there, working for the now late Alice Mayhew. He, a visiting student from the University of Georgia. Long edited story short, he too got a job working with Alice, who was really one of the editors of all time, and we'll talk about her a little bit later. Henry and I reconnected when Alice died last January, after which I wrote a piece about her for the New York Times on what it was like to work with her, for her, which Henry read. A lunch later, picnics in Central Park later, dinners later, here we are together again. I want to mention that Henry is not only one of the industry's best editors, he's also one of its best cooks. His secrets? He doesn't follow recipes verbatim. He alters them, which is an apt metaphor for what he does so well as an editor. Henry and I are going to zoom into each other and talk in just a few minutes. Later, you're going to send us some questions, which we'll address here at the end, as many as we can. So think now about a question you want to send and send it to the Q&A down on your screen, and we'll process those later. But first, some very fast name dropping of people and writers Henry has edited and worked with. Amy Ephron, Gail Collins, Bruce Feiler, Simon Winchester, Buzz Aldrin, Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner, Ken Blanchard, Joy-Ann Reid, and yes, Barack Obama. But first, before we get to the conversation, I want to show you a very brief clip from Genius, which was a terrible movie about the editor Maxwell Perkins and the writer Thomas Wolfe. Can we just see a few seconds of that?
Every word matters.
No, it doesn't.
They're vital.
Nonsense.
Vital.
No, you're losing the plot. He's falling in love. What was it like the first time you fell in love, Tom? Was it cornstalk yellow and pompous Chesterfield?
It was a lightning bolt.
And that's what it should be. A lightning bolt. Save all the thunder.
I got you. I got you. Cut that. Cut that. All right. We cut the
Wow, Henry, the editor's life is so tumultuous. I had no idea. Is that what your life is like and has been like all these years?
It's just like that, David. Every bit of work I ever did with an author was always done in a smoky bar. You know, that's actually an interesting, that film is an adaptation of a biography that was published that's very significant to editors of my generation, because it's the title of the biography is Editor of Genius by a biographer named Scott Berg. And many of my generation like to blame Scott Berg for getting us into being editors, because Maxwell Perkins was also Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald's editor, and let's just say it's not like that anymore.
Well, when you came to New York from small town Georgia those decades ago, did you know you wanted to be an editor? Is that what you came to New York to be?
It sounds crazy, but yes, in fact, that is what I set out to do when I came to New York. I had studied journalism at the University of Georgia, which is a fantastic school of journalism, but I always say it taught me that I did not, in fact, want to be a journalist. And I had a cousin, a sort of connected cousin, not really cousin, who had been an editor in the business in the 60s and 70s, and she sort of inspired that idea for me.
And then you walked into my office and it was destiny from there.
That's exactly right. Yes, I, in fact, to get myself out of college, I concocted an independent study in book publishing. And I said to the professor who was sponsoring me, I must go interview this fellow, David Masello, in New York. Yes, not really, but yes, kind of.
Well, I was 23. He thought I was a bigger cheese than I was. Boy, you were disappointed when you got here and saw my windowless office, but you know, you made good on that.
Mm.
So when we think of editing, there's line editors, there's copy editors, there's acquiring editors, lots of kinds of editors. But the real mystery is what an editor does to make a book better, to shape it, to sharpen it. What really is involved in that process?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And, you know, I would say that all editors probably work in different ways. I began to look at it over the years as sort of from 2 points of view. I borrowed the prefixes that are usually before the word economics, micro and macro. And there's macro editing, in which I sort of think of it as sort of developmental editing. You're working with the author and the overall organization or structure of the book. You're working with them on whether or not they have developed their ideas well enough. In fiction, you're looking at things, I mean, I was going to say, well, in fiction, you're looking at things like plot, storyline, character development, character relationships with each other, atmosphere, things like that. I also always say that, you know, people think plot is not a part of nonfiction books, but it absolutely is. And it's working on those elements of the book, which are, in my view, take a sort of broader macro view of the book. But then there is also a more micro view, which involves what's commonly called line editing, and the reason they call it line editing is because it's literally editing line by line by line of the page. It's very painstaking. It could go on forever. I always like to say to authors when they're asking me, what do I do? And describing line editing, I tell them that I do a great deal of line editing. I was taught by Alice to be a line editor. And but I always say to them, I am perfectly open to the idea that I might meet a manuscript that does not need any line editing. And I've been at this for, I guess, 40 years now, and I'm still waiting for that manuscript that doesn't need line editing.
So everyone needs an editor, in other words.
I don't want to say that absolutely, but I think every author can benefit from an editor in the same way that a play benefits from a director.
I remember years after I left publishing, I worked at Town and Country magazine, and I commissioned a famous editor-in-chief, the editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster, who's a man still alive. And he sent me an essay And I remember the first paragraph of the essay was 137 words. I've never forgotten that. And I thought, well, this is impossible. This is the editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster. How could he write a 137-word sentence? I don't know if that was like a ploy to get me to edit it or what, but it sort of confirmed for me that everybody needs an editor. Mm. Now, you're what's known as a trade book editor. For those in the audience who don't know what that term means, what does trade books mean?
Well, I'm not sure how that term got applied. I'd be interested in knowing the origin of that, and I'm not even sure why. But I am a trade book editor. My experience is working with. There's sort of a new. I'm sure everyone's familiar with. The last 50, 60 years, I'm going to butcher this word, the conglomerarization of book publishers, meaning they're all owned by larger corporations. And today they're spoken of as the big five. Right. Although since one of the biggest of the big five is in the process of buying one of the other five, they're going to be known as the big four really soon. And there are multiple imprints in them. In other words, those publishers publish trade books. The easiest way to understand what a trade book is, go look at Barnes and Noble. Those are the trade books. Okay, right. Whereas academic books, that's a whole different endeavor. It's usually, I should have said that earlier, the contrast is academic books, which are not normally found at, can be on occasion, but are not normally found at Barnes and Noble. I'm not even frankly quite sure how they're sold, through websites and mail order or other ways like that. Sure. Now, you've told me many anecdotes about your work as an editor, and one that continues to intrigue me is when you were working in Alice Mayhew's office while she was editing Bob Woodward's book on the CIA. And I believe she sent you to DC on some sort of mission. And if you could tell people what that errand was and what it was like ultimately to spend time with Bob Woodward. Well, okay. Yes, I was quite the young pup at that time, and just a bit of background. I had, as I just said earlier, I majored in journalism at the University of Georgia, and one of the things I recall being pounded into my head, and you have to remember when I was at University of Georgia, this was 79 through 82, and don't anybody forget that the film All the President's Men had come out 2 or 3 years before that. I'm forgetting the date exactly, but it was very fresh in people's minds. And the journalism professors wanted to hammer it into our heads that we were never going to work at the New York Times, never work with the Washington Post, never be Woodward, and never be Bernstein. So anyway, so there I am a couple of years later working for nowhere near Woodward or Bernstein, but working for their editor, Alice, who had been their editor for their first book, All the President's Men. And Bob Woodward had this new book about the CIA, William Casey, and the CIA, and it was hush, 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 hush. And she called me into her office and said, I have an errand for you. I'm so sorry I have to do, but I have to send you down to Washington. And I remember her whispering to me, Woodward's crazy, meaning that, and then the next thing I know, she's saying, it's sealed in a package, you take it down, then you'll bring it back at the end of the day, et cetera, and he's gonna call you. And so I sit there and look at the phone, and he calls about an hour later. And of course, I don't really know what he actually looks like, so I imagine I'm talking to Robert Redford on the other end of the phone. He tells me I have to change cabs in New York, and then I have to change cabs in Washington. It's all very deep throat, hush, hush, hush. Anyway, I arrive there. He's one of the nicest authors I ever met, very nice man. I can't say where I worked with him very much. He took the manuscript upstairs, and then I worked with his research assistant on doing photographs, which are not super secret at all. And then at some point, we hear from downstairs, lunch, and we go barreling downstairs, and Woodward is there, and lo and behold, so is Carl Bernstein. So I may not have ever become Woodward and Bernstein, but I had lunch with them one day. I had turkey sandwiches with them once.
I hope you told the professor that.
I thought of sending him a note, but yeah, if it had been email, if we'd had email in those days, he would have gotten one, definitely.
If you could have done a selfie with the three of you on, K Street or something, that would have worked out well. Now, there's this is a minor question, or what I was about to say is a fun question, but I remember you you told me there's no such thing as a fun question. This can be a fun event. But so this is a very minor question, but I thought it was sort of amusing because I remember you telling me this. You said that there are two overused words that you always get when you get manuscripts. And I want to say to everybody out there, just think what those two words might be that are the most overused words in a manuscript. Now, they're not obvious, so don't be angry with yourself if you can't figure out what those words are. But tell everybody what the two most overused words are and why they annoy you so much.
Well, I should clarify. These are Henry's most over. I don't overuse them, but I consider them the most overused two words in the English language, and they are, drum roll please. The first one is the one that nags at me a great deal, is very. So everyone ask yourself, when something is very something, is it really more than it was when it wasn't very? So, and the other one that really bugs me is that. Almost every time you find it in a sentence, I search through manuscripts seeing how many times I have to leave the word that, and it's very rare.
Well, so very and that. Okay. So
very and that are my pet peeve overused words.
Well, I'm about to use one of those. I just realized you worked very closely on Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father. He was then a young Chicago lawyer. You were then a young editor at Random House, I believe. And I think you're actually probably the same age. Tell us how you
6 months older than the former president.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope you send birthday cards to each other. Tell us how you became involved in that book, which some people, and I've heard this from other people, which some people claim was really key to his winning the presidency. The book was that important. But how did you become involved with that book?
It does have I think it's actually a slightly interesting origin story, but I will tell it very quickly. Soon after he was elected president of the Harvard Law Review, there was a great flurry of, well, there was actually a New York Times profile that led publishers to jump all over him. There'd been an agent who's still a close friend of mine who had been tracking him as well. It was sold at auction, meaning several publishers bid on it, and it ended up with an imprint and that took care of it for a good number of years. And he had still not finished it. It morphed into several different books over time. It was very much a memoir. It evolved into a memoir, and for anyone who's read it, they know it has 3 parts. He had completed part 1 and part 2. It was extremely long, and it had become extremely late. And the publisher who had it under contract basically let it go. It's not that unusual. Well, it's a little bit unusual actually, but they had reason. I can tell you that. And so the agent who, again, I was someone who's still a friend of mine, Jane Distel. I'm never going to forget her having called me on the phone and started her sales pitch to me. She was in a bit of a bind. I mean, she had a book she'd sold for some money, and now it was canceled, and she was needing to find a publisher for it. And she was pitching me on it. And at one point in the phone call, she said to me, "You know, Henry, you have to buy this book because I'm telling you, this guy's going to be the first Black president of the United States." And that was about 1993 or 1992. And and she sent it over, and it failed what I call the from across the room test, meaning when the manuscript stacks up on the desk like that, that means it's too long. And that was only parts 1 and 2. He had yet to even begin part 3. I don't want to, you know, I can tell you, I've said this to many other people. I would have said it to you at the time. I had to publish this book by the time I got to the 2nd page. I just thought, I just thought this is an extraordinary writer, and I sort of knew the story, and I was immediately engaged in it. And so I signed it up.
What was your working relationship with him like? What did that entail?
Well, you know something, this is so, I really feel a little bit like I'm cheating here by saying this, but he was one of the best working relationships I've ever had, because I recall, again, what was our primary job? Again, the thing was like, you know, you could put house plants on it, you know, and so it had to be cut. And, you know, I've had this with a number of other authors where something is very long. What an editor will often do, or my technique with him was, okay, here's a 20-page story, or here's a story, you tell it 20 pages. I suggest you rewrite it in 4 pages, approaching it in the following way. Well, what was interesting about him is he would come back and I would recall how I had suggested that he redraft it. And he would follow the instruction that it needed to be 4 pages, but it was much better conceived and pulled together than I had suggested. Now, a lot of people think, well, as an editor, does that make you feel like, well, why didn't he do what I told him to do? No, that's the most satisfying experience.
And how amenable was he to these dramatic changes and cuts?
Well, to those of you who may be reading his new 700-page book, you may be surprised to learn that he was, which is brilliant, by the way, but he understood what needed to be done. If you're asking me, did he resist me? Not at all. He knew that needed to be done. And then, of course, the other thing that we did was we strategized how to write. The third part which is about him going to Africa, to Kenya, and finding his family, his father's family, to have that linked problem not occur.
Sure. And then years later, and everybody has seen this photo, there's a whole series of these photos, a series of photos that appear on the program here. Years later, you visited President Obama, then President Obama, at the Oval Office. So what were some impressions, and what was that experience like?
Well, when he was reelected in 2012, and I was working with a reporter who covered the White House and who had been to one of the White House Christmas parties, and in the receiving line, mentioned to President Obama that I was his editor. The president sent me fond wishes, which was amazing. And so I said, you know something, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to know and admire the man in the Oval Office. I'm going to see what I can do to get there. I believe my 2 daughters may be watching this now. I said, this is an opportunity to give them an experience like that. And it was a multi-year letter writing, contact ribbing to get there. And he was amazing. He was really, spent when I say significant amount of time, I don't want to give anybody the impression we were sitting there for hours discussing policy with the president, but he took time with us in the Oval Office, and he was very nice. And to put it mildly, I'll never forget it.
Well, those photos of you, and the photo that appears on this program, I mean, there's just pure joy on your face. And one of your daughters is included in that photo. What were their impressions of him? What did they say after the meeting?
Well, I think they were just wowed by the experience, and he, you know, I don't think it was to be surprising to anybody here. He did, not only did he speak to me, but he spoke to them as well. So,
sure. Now you work now as a much in demand independent editor, and while you've edited all genres and still do, nonfiction, politically focused books seem to be your forte, though obviously you do fiction and everything else. And subjects and people that you have worked on include President Obama, Martin Luther King, Tiananmen Square, Lincoln's assassination, FDR, the moon landing, Sesame Street. Now, tomorrow, America's history changes. Thank God. How might that affect you as an editor, and how might it affect the world of books, this change that's going to happen tomorrow?
Well, I can't know how it's going to affect me. I know how it's going to affect me personally, but that's not what this conversation is about. I mean, I think publishing books today, anybody who pays attention to the bestseller list can see that current events topics in books have always been very popular, but they seem to be even more popular now. You know, I don't want to discuss the outgoing president other than to describe a publishing phenomenon of the last 4 years called the Trump bump. You know, publishers have made a great deal of money publishing books about Trump. And there was an article in the Times in the last week or so about how many post-Trump presidency books are already under contract. He's been very good. He's been very good for the publishing business.
Right.
You know, what do I think the Biden administration will hold? You know, one thing that is always true when a new administration comes in, you know, there'll be the 100 days books that will likely come out in the fall. It takes a little while for it. Let's just put it this way: authors writing about the Biden administration need some material.
It's true. So they haven't.
So it'll take a year or so, yeah, before they actually have something to write about. They're always the classic 100 days books, as I said.
The nature of political books, though, and I know that Alice Mayhew, who was really that was really her world, publishing books based on politics. Don't books on politics become easily dated? How do you prevent that from happening?
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, you know, for instance, you mentioned it was one of my absolute favorite authors I've ever worked with is Joy-Ann Reid, who's I edited her 2 books, a book called Fracture, which was about Obama and the Clintons, and it was basically it was really about how race has driven the Democratic Party for decades now, and then inevitably she wrote a book about Trump, which is called The Man Who Sold America. And, you know, while I was working with Joy on the book, we knew it was going to be completed, published 3 months later. I was very happy for it. It was, you know, a 4-week New York Times bestseller. And yeah, I mean, there would be sections of that book today. I would recommend it because there's sections of the book where Joy's an incredible thinker and a great researcher. There's sections of the book that I would recommend to people who read the whole book. It really, with a book about a sitting president, you're right, David, 4 months after it's published, it's hard not to say that it's out of date.
Right, exactly.
However, I applaud whenever anyone is reading long form journalism. And I think it was an opportunity in that case, for instance, to Joy to pause and look at where the Trump administration was. And a lot of her book is very much about what it had done to the country at that point.
Sure. Now, you mentioned earlier the notion of finding a plot in nonfiction books. It's a very interesting idea. I think people tend to think of plot as a fictional device. Elaborate on that a bit. What does it mean to find a plot in a nonfiction book? How do you get it and how do you nurture it?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is set aside one category of nonfiction book, and I've edited a great many of them, and that's memoir. Right. And memoir, you know, I'll give you my corny line. I say to authors, your memoir must satisfy its reader in the same way that great novel does, except you've got one problem: you can't make up anything. It's supposedly true, and most of them are. And but it should satisfy in the exact same way: character development, plotting, pacing, structure, all of that. To nonfiction that's more look, I can tell you this, like the book I did with Joy Reid, I'm forgetting exactly when it was published. I think it was published 2.5 years into his presidency. Yes, that had to have a plot in the sense that it had to work from it had to have a chronology I worked with, I'll give you a different example. I worked with Stephen Dubner and Stephen Levitt, the authors of Freakonomics. I worked with them on, I was not the editor of Freakonomics, but they're 3 books that came after that. And they are masters of what I would call the mini plot. I mean, in a lot of ways, authors like Oliver Sacks perfected this. The collection of nonfiction short stories, they're plots within chapters. They tell anecdotes. It has to work in that way.
Sure. Now, I know you teach a course.
Or the other thing, if it is sort of to say, when someone has a book that's sort of, they're proving a point, or they have they want to prove something, the plot itself is the development of the idea, the making of the point.
Sure. Now, I know you teach a course in writing memoirs. What sort of advice do you give the writers who you work with? What are some of the secrets to writing a successful memoir? In part, you've just answered that, but elaborate on that.
Well, I have a couple of sort of isms, if you will, in an attempt to help people in writing their own story. And, one of the first ones is, and these are my made up headlines here. One is go small. I find, I taught a class, I don't know, 9 months ago, and a lovely woman I knew, I'd gotten to know a little bit, and the next thing I know, in 6 paragraphs, she had told us the first 30 years of her life, and I had to say, my example of go small is why don't you start by telling us about the summer you were 12 years old? One of my other isms, and something I'm going to tell you, this comes from our friend, the beloved Alice. Chronology is your best friend. And keep in mind that the best way of storytelling, you always should remember that I always put it, Tuesday becomes before Wednesday, Tuesday comes before Wednesday, Wednesday becomes before Thursday, Thursday becomes before Friday, always has, always will. Keep that in mind when you're telling a story.
So many people digress from that when writing a memoir, and that's where they get into trouble.
That's where they get into trouble. I will tell you that I imagine every writer I work with goes away like this. Oh, if he uses the word outline one more time, I'm going to scream. I believe in outlining. I don't, particularly when it comes to books, it sounds like I have all these sayings. Well, I shouldn't have all these sayings, but I have all these sayings. One is a book is a house, right? Well, and then the rooms in the house are the chapters in the book, right? So you're going to build a house without an architectural plan? I don't think so. So we're going to have an outline.
I mean, some writers balk at that, and they think that an outline actually hinders their creativity. Do you think that is the case for some people, or do you tell them to get over it?
I think you should get over it. I have an answer to that. I hear that quite often, and the answer is, and outlines are made to be broken.
Okay,
and they're made to be altered. And I also say I expect us to hit bumps in the outline path, and when we hit the bump, we'll correct. We'll alter it, fix it.
Sure, that's.
I'm working with a memoirist right now, and she has an absolutely fascinating story. I've said to her in many of our conversations about it, okay, let's admit that the first 2 chapters of your book could actually be one memoir, and all these things. And I can tell you, I've worked with her over the last week and a half or so to do the layout for her book, and it's just changed everything for her. For one thing, the reason I think the outline is so valuable is, even though I told her, I don't want you to write chapter 8 first, but with this outline, you could just go write chapter 8. You know what to do for chapter 8.
Right. I remember Alice Mayhew, and you probably remember this as well. Alice Mayhew always talked about the introduction to a book being the last thing that should be written. I think a lot of people think it's the first thing when in fact it's the last thing. And do you remember that phrase she would always use about what an introduction is?
Are we going to do it together?
Well,
An introduction tells the reader how to read the book. Yes, I have to say I've used that line with some people and they say to me, huh?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I agree with it, but I invoke it all the time as well. So you think an outline is equally important for a work of fiction?
Yes, although I have to say, I think that there's more latitude for change with an outline to fiction, but I agree with you, and I try to get writers to do that. I will say, I've worked with a lot of commercial fiction authors, and commercial fiction can be helped by thrillers, for instance, where the plotting is absolutely essential. It's probably, even though readers don't recognize this, I mean, most do, that is the primary thing that you're getting. And for it to build and to reach its conclusion, outlines are necessary. Some literary fiction is less so. But again, because it's fiction, you can just get to a place and say, well, this plot isn't working, let's alter it in the following way. Sometimes with nonfiction, what happened.
Right. Is this a demand you make on your writers, or is it a strong suggestion about the outline?
Okay. Well, I don't demand anything. I strongly suggest. I suggest, yes.
Sure. Now, I know that you worked for and with Alice Mayhew for, what was it, 5 years, I think. And you said something to me that resonates still. You said that working for anyone other than Alice was a demotion. Why do you say that?
Well, obviously it wasn't really a demotion, and I know that many of the young editors who worked for her felt that way. I mean, it was just by the time I was working for Alice, which was 1983, I guess Alice was a very well-established editor by that point. She had, her two big, she's very known for All the President's Men and was working with Woodward up. Unfortunately, I don't think she actually had any involvement in his last book about Rage, about Trump, but she'd done the one before, Fear. But she was All the President's Men, but she also had a colossal hit with a book called Our Bodies, Ourselves by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. So she was well established, and she was very known in Washington, and she just had the best authors. I mean, when I started working for her, when you started working for her, she had a young writer who at the time was known as Doris Kearns, who I very much recall her insisting to Alice, against Alice's, which Alice didn't care for this too much, that she was now Doris Kearns Goodwin, taking her husband's last name. And we all know how that turned out.
Exactly.
But so it was rare air up there. It was great, and then the next thing I knew, after I left her, I'm on my own scrambling to try to get some authors to publish.
The thing about Alice is that she was incredibly warm and generous in every way, and yet there was something kind of intimidating about her. Would you agree with that?
I still hear from people. I was on a phone call about 2 weeks ago with a very well-established agent who started talking about and she said that notorious, scary Alice Mayhew, and I had to pipe up and say, well, she had a bark, but as Alice was the sweetest person ever, really.
She really was. But I too was so afraid of her even after I left, and I would be walking down Fifth Avenue because I lived in the Village, as did she, and I would sometimes see her and I would panic, and I think, why am I panicking? I like this person. She likes me. We would have lunch. I worked with her for years, but there was something about her that was that way. And Henry and I were looking recently at the new biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that just came out. Who wrote that book? I forget.
David Michaelis, I think, David Michaelis.
And we were just happened to be flipping through it, and it was incredibly moving because Henry always goes to the acknowledgments in every book to sort of see who gets merited. And sure enough, this turned out to be Alice Mayhew's last book that she edited. And I don't want to paraphrase it so poorly, but the writer had said to the effect that when Alice was in the hospital, she was actually editing this book with the pages of the book spread out on the bed. And it was an incredibly moving thing. And it was incredibly moving for Henry and I, because we met through Alice Mayhew. We reconnected through Alice Mayhew when she passed away in January. And then to come across this book, which we both admire and enjoy, and to see that this was actually her last book. So there was a very interesting echo there. Now, you've already said this in part, but what did you learn from Alice? What are some lessons that she taught you that you continued and continue to apply as an editor?
Well, I learned a lot of things from her that are just technical about editing, which are, I can't, and you can ask me to name one and I can't remember them, but I know I learned, I don't distinguish them and they're not that interesting. But sort of from observing her work and observing her attitude, and it was about who she was and what she did in the world of writers, I appreciated and I took away with me, and it stayed with me forever. And I watched other editors, frankly, act in other ways. And it was that it's not about us, that our job is to push the authors into the spotlight, and that we're really behind the scenes people. And I admired that about her. And I've tried to do that myself.
Yeah, no, I think there are the celebrity editors. Many of us, even many people in the audience, are aware of celebrity editors because they want their name out there. But you're a modest guy. You seem to prefer to cede some kind of control in that regard. I remember seeing that when I was working for Alice, one of the authors had dedicated the book to her, and I thought, oh my God, she's going to be thrilled when she sees this. And I got finished copies of the book, and we opened them up, and I showed her the title page, and it said, "For Alice Mayhew, my editor." And she got so angry. I don't know if you...
I remember this. Yes, we should not say who the author was. Well, you know something, I will tell you, I worked with a novelist for almost 20 years. And you know something, and he was a book a year author. And I will have to tell you, you know, when, I don't remember what it was, meaning he produced a novel every year. You know what, when you're an author who you run out of people to dedicate the book to. I mean, he dedicated to his daughters, each one together, you know, my wife and my daughters, just my wife, you know, so it was probably inevitable that one of these was I was going to get pegged with one of them. And
Right.
I had an Alice flashback. I did the thing that I'm fairly sure Alice did, which was, I think Alice actually ignored it, but I had to thank him very much, but I hated it.
I mean, I think she
felt like my role. So
yeah, I mean, she likes being in the acknowledgments, but she didn't want the book to be dedicated to her. It was a very interesting dynamic. It was something, as a very young man then, it was very impressionable, and it really stayed with me. And of course, Alice was famous for her drawer of postcards, and she would reach in there and pull out a postcard and write a thank you note to people, just sort of constantly throughout the day. She did, at least when I was there. I'm sure you probably remember that. Again, that's a habit I still do. I like sending postcards. So we're going to, I see there's lots of questions here. So we're going to take some time to answer some questions. And I've actually gotten some already that I have printed out here. And then I'm going to go to these latest questions. So these are from the many people out here. So this is from Roger in Georgia, which is your home state. How do you like that?
it is, yeah.
So Roger writes, "We continue to hear about the death of the book, but books continue to be published. Is it possible, in your opinion, that the book, as we know it, will go the way of the dodo bird? If it survives, how will it survive, and in what form?"
Well, Roger in Georgia, you know something, first of all, you have to say what you mean by the book. I mean, because are you talking about as I said earlier, a long form piece of writing, be it fiction or nonfiction, I don't think there's any, I don't see any death for that at any time soon, because there's such an incredible value to it. And there's also, there are people who want to write them and there are people who want to read them. Okay, I'm not one necessarily to speak about, is there sometime a death of the printed book? It doesn't seem to have happened. There was I can't remember which, there's no question if you said, what's the biggest change in your career, Henry, in the book publishing industry? Was ebooks. It's an enormous technological change. And in my opinion, a really good change. But there was a great deal of concern that, oh, does this mean that the print book is going to disappear? Hasn't. And in fact, what happened, I don't have numbers, I don't have statistics, somebody else would be better to speak to this, but ebooks kind of hit a plateau. I mean, I happen to be an enormous fan of them personally. So,
that's a scandal here.
But I call myself the world's publisher's best friend, because I will buy the hardcover book, read the first 100 pages of it, love it, and then download the ebook and go back and forth and back and forth. So,
Why do you do that? Why do you read that way?
Well, because I'm a hardcover book lover and they mean something to me and I like to covet them. But you know something, when, back when we all used to take subways, which we don't anymore, there's nothing like having your book with you and there's nothing like having it on your iPhone. So
I have yet to read an ebook, but that's my problem, not yours.
I've read 1,000-page biographies on my iPhone.
Well, here's a question from Emanuele, who lives in New Jersey. What is the one most important skill you need to be successful in what you do as an editor?
Now I'm worried I'll say that I say something and I don't have it. I think you have to love books. I think you have to have a sense for what's a successful story? What's a story that you think will interest a large number of people? And you have to read a lot. I think you have to sort of have a sense for how language works and how sentences group together. And I feel like I'm failing at this question.
Well, it's always hard when someone says, what's the most important of anything? But that's good.
Okay, since it was the most, I would say a really good sense for a really good story.
Okay, great. Here's a question, and you have to forgive me because I can't see exactly on my screen if it's Tara or Laura, but what is the first thing you do when addressing a manuscript, when it lands on your desk?
Well, I don't want to state the obvious, but the first thing I do is I have to read it, and I have to read it and get a sense of what the writer's voice is. I'm repeating something I just said earlier. Their relationship with language, the way that they connect sentences. I had to find sort of a problem that I will notice right away is when a writer creates paragraphs, but the sentences in the paragraph don't relate to each other in some way.
Sure. Okay. Well, here's another question. This is from Philippa, who I think lives in Philadelphia. And she asks, for young people today with an interest in this kind of work, publishing, what kind of advice would you offer them?
Read. I don't think there's anything that you can the way you can train yourself. If what you're wanting to do is to get into the publishing business on the editorial side, you should become a very skilled reader. It's a very much an apprentice business. Like, I thought to myself when I, came to work for Alice that having a degree in journalism would be helpful. In its way, it was, in the sense that Alice did a lot of newsworthy books, and I was sort of up on the news, and I knew how to read news and that sort of thing. But it was really training on the job. So it's your sort of your classic liberal arts education apprentice type of profession.
Right. And are there jobs still in publishing? Just to sort of echo that question a little more. I mean, is it a difficult?
Again, I know the editorial side. I mean, that people who are interested in publicity and marketing and sales, their
Right.
jobs there. I mean, I know it a little bit, but I should only speak to editorial. Yes, editors are always looking for entry-level positions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That in my day, your day, the HR department was meaningless, but it's they're more involved in entry-level hiring today than they used to be. So if someone knows someone, I would say try to form a contact with someone in an HR department. And if you think you made a contact with them and you haven't been in touch with them in 2 months, you've let too much time go by. You have to stay constantly in touch with them, because they never know when a position is going to come open.
Sure. Here's another question from one of the viewers. Is there a classic novel you wish you could edit and make better?
Oh.
I can think of a lot of them, but I think some of the classics.
A classic novel that I could edit and make better. I think I may be stumped by this question. What about you, David? Was a classic novel you could edit?
Oh, put me on the spot. I would think, no, I remember reading An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser. And I remember taking really I would pinch 100 pages and just move it and keep going and pinch another 100 words and keep moving. So that's sort of one of mine that I would absolutely.
Well, I think what an issue there, and I don't think any of us can stop ourselves from this. We have sort of modern standards. It's impossible that with a book like that, our attention spans are shorter.
Sure.
And we have to remember that people, when Theodore Dreiser was published, people didn't watch television. They didn't,
Right. So they made, what was the famous movie they made from American Tragedy?
Place in the Sun.
Place in the Sun, right.
Yes.
That's a good version of that novel.
Very good film.
So here's another question. If I can read it with my new glasses and my new prescription. Moving on from the original question, who is an author, or what is the subject matter that you very much would like to edit? This is somebody who was listening. They picked up on the two most overused words that you very much would love to edit. So subject matter and an author who you'd very much like to edit.
Subject matter. Something. I'm one of these Kennedy family, Kennedy administration people who thinks it's an endlessly fascinating subject. An author. It was the go-to must-have. Nobody was ever going to get. Would I have loved to have been worked with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis on her memoir? Yes, but I also am like a lot of people who think that she was one of the classiest women of all time, and one of the classiest things she ever did was not write a memoir. I mean, we live in an intensely confessional age where everybody has to write a book. So I have to say I do find myself admiring some people who don't. That was a roundabout answer to that question, but
no, that's lovely. I have an endless fascination with Jackie Onassis as well, and I confess that when I worked in publishing, I used to call her office. Actually, I worked in magazine publishing then, And I would call her office just to hear the secretary say, Mrs. Onassis's office, just to hear that. And I would make up some ridiculous question to ask her. Like I just had to find out something from her office. So that was my little thrill. But I agree with
I
you.
hope that you're such, yes, I'm calling to ask whether or not she's completed her memoir yet.
So here's another question. It's a long question, but maybe I can edit this down. It says, I believe all writers need editors. It takes a village to bring a book into the world. I've read some well-known writers who have not used editors as they should, and it seems the books have suffered for it. What do you think of the successful author who doesn't use or listen to an editor?
Well, before I have to, I see that something came in the chat that a friend of mine I didn't know was going to be here, so I must wave hello to Jacqueline Duvall. It feels like that question is in some way set up. I think I'm prejudiced because of what I do. I think that authors benefit from an editor because often they will show their books to family and friends, and they will not always get an honest response. And I also like to think that in addition to being having acquired experience over the years in providing authors with good advice about their books based on my experience, but I also know how to deliver it in constructive ways. Like, I will say that there are one or two authors that I was doing a lot of work cutting their books that they affectionately referred to me as Henry the Butcher, but but they wanted it. It was a little bit, I can't say that, former President Obama referred to me that way, but yeah, I had to butcher his manuscript and others, but I just think over the years I've learned how to deliver this in constructive ways. It still can be hard for any writer. Look, anybody who's written a book twice as long, they thought all of it was really good. It was 2 times too long. They thought all of it was good.
So we'll have time for 2 more questions here. And there's many versions of this question that have come in, which is, if I wanted to, not surprisingly, if I wanted to hire you as my editor, how do I do that? And what do you charge? Sorry for such a base question, but that many versions of that question have come in.
You can't afford me. No, well, I have a website. It is creatively entitled henryferris.com. You can reach me through the website, and frankly, what I charge is it depends. It depends. It depends on what it is. It depends on how long it is. It depends on how much work it needs. And I'm sorry, but it depends.
Okay. And we'll do another final question here, and I'll say goodbye to everybody. Are there any particular kinds of stories you think are particularly timely right now?
Well, I could range all over the place. I don't think there's anything more timely and important than the issues related to climate change. But I will also tell you something, though, anybody who shares this opinion of mine, anybody in book publishing will tell you that when it comes to book subjects, that is the kiss of death. It is like, it's what do you call a publisher who publishes a book about the climate change issue? A fool. That people don't buy books on that subject, with the exception of Al Gore's book, which was connected with the documentary he did so many years ago. I feel like I'm being asked to answer questions of what I think are subject matter of national importance. What do I think a book might say? I think if someone can get to the issue of what to do about the issue of disinformation in the country, could potentially have a bestseller. But
sure.
I think one of the things that publishers see consistently is that what people are looking for in a book, and it's what I've given advice to all authors, is people are looking for the sustained what I call the sustained narrative, meaning you pick up a book and you know who's particularly good at this is the best-selling author Erik Larson, who whose first book was Devil in the White City, and he has a book now. It's something splendid in the vine. It's about Winston Churchill. You know, if I had to do an analysis of what works about his books is he picks a historical subject, a slice of a story or something, and that's a novel.
It is. People always refer to Erik Larson's books as novels, and they stop themselves. And it's not a novel. It's nonfiction.
Well, it's like what I said about Memoir. It's like he makes the books work as a novel, but he does a great deal of research as well.
Good.
So they're historically accurate and true.
Well, I hear the 8 p.m. church bells in my neighborhood ringing. So
you're going to church, David?
It's not going to happen, but I don't know what happens in there, but they ring it at 8 o'clock every night. Actually, they ring it every hour all the way through the night. So I wanted to thank you, Henry, for this. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I just wanted to add that we're all entering a new and good era in America tomorrow. And with that, we can rejoice. And if you disagree with me on that, you can edit me out of your book, because I happen to think it's great news. And I wanted to thank you, Henry, for giving us this edited version of your life. You're a big volume of accomplishments. There are, as people can see behind him, and there are many more volumes to come. So thank you, Henry. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to the National Arts Club, which I miss dearly because we can't go in there yet, but we all will be there again. So thank you all and good night.
Thank you, David.